The first thing that we need to do is to construct our LED matrix. And we can do this with 9 LEDs. Now in this case, I'm using red LEDs, which have a voltage drop of about 2 volts. Now just a quick review about LEDs. An LED will have 2 pins, a cathode pin and an anode pin. And there's a way to figure that out. The cathode pin will be the shorter of the 2 pins, and also it will have this longer flat section, whereas the anode will be longer and be narrow at the top. Now what we must do with these 9 LEDs is we need to bend them so they look like this, where I have the cathode coming out to the left and I have the anode coming down. To be clear about that, I'll draw that so that we're looking from the top. So I have 2 pins and I'll have my anode pointing down. Anode I can represent with a positive sign. And then my cathode coming out to the left, which I can represent by a negative sign. Now notice that I have these at an angle. And that is so that they won't overlap each other later. So it's important that we have this angle between these 2 pins. Once you get that done, you should have 9 LEDs that are positioned with this 90-degree angle. Now you have to make sure that your cathodes are all pointing in the same direction. And that's because the next step of what we're going to do is we're going to solder all of the cathodes together for one row or one column, however you want to see it. So you can visually inspect if all of those look like they're in the same orientation. If you've done it correctly when you're holding it like this, it should look like this picture right here. And then of course these want to just point out, your anodes want to point out perpendicular to that. Also another thing to notice, which might not be very clear here, is that for each one of these, I've actually put my anode out a little bit farther than my cathode. And this is so when I do the when I put the anodes together that they won't be touching. So your cathode you should bend very close to the bulb, whereas the anode you want that to be further down. You can see how this works because you'll see these little notches, and so you can bend right underneath that notch. Whereas with the cathode, you want to bend about here. Okay, so I need to do some soldering. Of course, to do some soldering, I need a soldering iron. And of course, make sure you have some sort of safety goggles. Molten metal in your eyes, not your best friend. If all that goes well, you should have 3 sets of LEDs that look like this. Now, what you need to do with these is connect the anodes with one another. And so we'll have our cathodes pointing out that we've already connected, but then our anodes underneath will each be connected in rows as well. Just make sure that when you're doing this that you don't see any connections between your anodes and cathodes. Those should be separate all the time. And finally, if all goes to plan, you should have something like this, a 3x3 LED matrix. And flipping it over, we should see no connections between the anodes and cathodes. Now if you want with that, you can try hooking these up to a power supply if you have one. You should be able to light individually any of those LEDs, just as a quick check that everything's okay.